We are Tina Rassalle and Sophie Schmidt, and today we want to talk about the code and rules that are implemented in historical video games, which can shift a player's perception of the past.
This particular kind of research on video games and the past is a relatively new field called Archaeogaming. The term Archaeogaming was first coined by Andrew Reinhardt in 2013 on his website archaeogaming.com in an article in which he discusses the gaming world of World of Warcraft as a space that can be analyzed by an archaeologist. Following the blog, Reinhardt wrote a dissertation and then a book called Archaeogaming, an introduction to archaeology in and of video games, which was published in 2018 and has quickly become the standard manual for archaeogaming research. Reinhardt defines archaeogaming as an archaeological framework which, broadly speaking, includes the study of archaeology in and of video games, as well as the use of video games for archaeological purposes. Now, we don't have space here to go into all the details of what archaeogaming is, but one aspect it incorporates is the archaeology of game mechanics and the entanglement of code with players. Video games are basically multi-sensory collections of nostalgia and interactive math. Through archaeogaming, we are trying to understand how game design manifests everything players see and interact with. These also include the rules that are implemented within the code of the game that players involuntarily need to follow in order to win the game. It is this kind of archaeogaming that we are going to explore here in this presentation, implemented on the genre of historical video games. We will look at two specific areas: the illusion of historical accuracy and the illusion of free will.
So what are historical games? Most video games have a game world, which is a fictional universe in which the game is set. If this game world has a direct reference to the past period of our real world, they fall under the category of historical games. Historical games tend to give the viewers clues as to in which time period the game is set. Sometimes this period is explicitly stated. For example, the intro into Far Cry Primal tells you that you are traveling back to 10,000 BCE. Assassin's Creed Valhalla sends your character into the year 873 CE, and Anno 1800 is named after the period it is set in, the 19th century. Other times, a historical game may just throw you into a story and will only give you subtle clues as to at what time period you are in. For example, in the game Ancestors: Stories of Atapuerca, you are introduced to the setting by an elderly Paleolithic woman who tells the story of her ancestors. Indirect pointers tell you when you are playing as a Homo antecessor or a Neanderthal. Thus, date or region markers, as they are sometimes called, help the players to situate themselves.
For example, the intro scene to Total War Rome 2 shows you a reconstruction of the Colosseum, letting you know that you are in ancient Rome. When traveling to Egypt, pyramids and camels are introduced. By using these kind of images, as well as different kinds of lighting or music, the game gives the player the impression of actually seeing and being in ancient Rome or Egypt. Felix Zimmermann calls this the historical atmosphere, which game developers deliberately aim at to invoke this immersion. For a complete feeling of immersion, though, players need to be able to recognize these visual clues as belonging to this particular time period. In other words, they need to be able to link the clue to their already existing knowledge or assumptions about the past. Therefore, game developers often and deliberately draw on existing images and stereotypes: the Colosseum for Rome, the pyramids and the camels for Egypt. Whether at the time the Colosseum had been built already or not is not as important as giving the players the easily identifiable hint: we are in ancient Rome. Here is the Colosseum. We must be in ancient Rome.
Should the atmosphere of a game deviate too much from the expectations of the player might feel put off. This is a well-documented phenomenon. A game may portray an armor with a certain historical accuracy, but if it deviates from the expected picture, it does not give the authentic feeling the player would like to see. Case in point, in the game Shogun 2, a general wears a horo mantle, which looks like an inflated balloon on the back of the person wearing it, just as they did in 16th century Japan. However, enough people felt this was unauthentic that consequently someone developed a no horo mod, which removed the mantle from the game. Even though in numerous discussion groups online, people were explaining that the depiction was actually very accurate.
Thus, the feeling of authenticity is different from actual historical accuracy. This process of using popular imagery to give an authentic but not necessarily accurate reimagining of the past in film has been named the cinematic aesthetic of authenticity by Marvin Dupree. It is the same technique that is being used in historical video games. According to Clemens Reisner, society's understanding of the past is shaped by the representation and retransmission of visual codes and signifiers produced by the media. The media draws this imagery from a cultural archive, which can be seen as a collective historical consciousness, filled with nostalgia, popular perceptions of the past, and cultural memory. For example, as Julian Wolterink has pointed out, in the medieval video game Mount and Blade from 2007, the player can be attacked by Viking-like raiders. While Vikings would be very anachronistic in the 13th century, Viking raiders are perhaps the most iconic and memorable example of medieval savagery, especially when compared to generic road bandits. As these bandits, however, are an important gameplay element in the action RPG Mount and Blade, it stands to reason that Vikings were being used as authentic imagery to invoke a medieval atmosphere of uncertainty and danger. In other words, people expect to see certain historical images, the game designers give them these images, and this re-emphasizes the notion of how the past actually looked like. We are stuck in a vicious circle.
A second area in which game developers influence the player's perception of the past can be exemplified using historical strategy games, such like Sid Meier's Civilization, Age of Empires, or The Settlers. These are all examples of 4X games. 4X games center around strategic, tactical, and logistical planning in order to achieve victory. The aims are to explore the game world, expand the territory, exploit natural resources, and/or exterminate the enemy. The play mechanics are so-called God mode, which means players usually fly over a map and make different units explore, exploit, attack, or defend, while at the same time having an overview over accumulated resources and things like idle workers. Jerry McCall uses a historical problem space framework to analyze different components of a game world system and the choices and actions a player agent is able to make within the system. In his view, historical games offer a historical problem space consisting of the player agent, who is some kind of historical actor, and the avatar of the player, the virtual game world, and game world elements such as agents, minions, resources, obstacles, and tools. In this problem space, the player tries to find strategies to win the game. To attain victory, the internal rules of the game must be learned and obeyed, which is one of the points in his framework we wish to focus on. In some games, the technological advancement of the player is spelled out in so-called tech trees. These trees visualize the techniques or developments the player needs to learn or purchase to be able to develop another one and receive the benefits that go with it. So in Sid Meier's Civilization series, you usually start in the Stone Age before the invention of farming and husbandry, but you can already see which paths to take so that one day, several thousand years later, you can develop the atomic bomb. Or go to the moon, whichever kind of victory you prefer, though a military victory tends to be easier to play. The linearity of this process, though, paints a pretty straightforward picture of the past, one that encourages to think of the past processes as natural developments that will always occur in the same order. As a society, we need to develop from uncivilized barbarians to highly technological beings in order to win history.
Technological innovation drives social progress and follows an inevitable course with the modern era as culmination. The idea of determinism, when embodied in a mechanism like a tech tree, as also pointed out by Tuur Gees, forms a script that influences the design and content of our popular culture, and thus our perception of the past. One does not win history by continuing to live the way you are. One should always strive for more land, more resources, more inventions. Here, it is of course clear that these kind of strategy games are heavily influenced by Western colonialism. A civilization or a culture which chooses to look inwards and solely focus on its own population will lose. In order to gain victory, one needs to expand, destroy, and exterminate. You do not win the game by having a perfect pacifist society where everybody is fed and happy. You only win if you are stronger than everybody else on the map. Oh, and if you no longer worship trees, but actually start building churches, that also helps. By instilling this kind of perception of the past and the present, developers of strategic video games shape our understanding of how a society should be run and what specific cultures are really the victors of the past.
All these mechanisms mentioned here are written within the code of the game following the rules of conditional statements. If this, then that. The act of playing is the act of following a decision tree, which of course has a huge number of branches. But the core rules are, if you develop this technology, then your units will gain these advantages. If you gathered X or greater than X resources, then you will be able to build this building. If you have built the building and gathered X amount of resources or greater than that, then you may step into the next age. Or else you won't. The hard code behind the decision trees determines that you will not be able to develop certain technologies if you did not develop others first. There is no way around these conditions that form the rules of the game. And in contrast to board games, where my player enemy might be gracious enough to give me a loan or help me out, thinking Monopoly here, my computer enemy and the game world will only let me break the rules if I know cheat codes, which are, again, programmed into the software. To make a long story short, games are not meant to let you invoke your free will or create a particular society of your choosing. Players get the illusion they can do anything within the conventions of the genre, but only certain actions are possible, and only some predetermined sequences of these actions will lead to winning the game. In discussion with students, this has been a difficult point for some to consider.
So, why should we as archaeologists and historians care? First of all, the video game industry is huge. Currently, video games make more money than the movie and music industry combined. Over 3 billion people in the world are now playing video games, and this number is only growing. Thus, the reality is that many people learn about our past through video games. Game developers thus have a huge responsibility and an influence on how the average person perceives the past. They make history by creating worlds in which historical events happen because of certain rules, thus informing players of imagined or real causal relationships. Often, the worlds and the rules depicted reinforce already established stereotypes, which are historically incorrect. We need to understand that these depictions are a part of our digital literacy, which are represented in code and are thus a choice made by someone. And these choices have real impacts. For example, Daniel Gear had 58 students from the University of Hanover play Assassin's Creed 3, which depicts the Boston Tea Party events in Boston. In his study, he discovered that every single student was influenced in the description of the historical Boston from the game's representation of the town, having no idea what elements were real and what was imagined or recreated by the game developers.
To be fair, we are of course limited in our possible reconstructions of past worlds by our historical and archaeological sources. Sebastian Hagenauer, who has a lot of experience in creating 3D models for museum exhibitions, states that the more realistic a reconstruction seems, with more levels of detail, better resolution, some grittiness, some people running around, the more people seem to believe its accuracy. The problem, he says, is the more detail he gives, the more speculation is incorporated in the reconstruction. In his case, the speculation might rely on primary and secondary sources, but nonetheless, speculation it remains. Now, for video game developers, how they speculate, which kinds of details they want added, is their choice, and this choice is often a deliberate one.
As academics and historical researchers, it is as paramount that we are involved in the creation of these games if we want people to have a more realistic or diversified picture of the past. By the same mechanics that we are criticizing here, games can actually be very useful tools to teach historical knowledge. People tend to play video games for many hours, many more hours than they would ever watch a documentary or take an academic class. Thus, we should take advantage of this medium and incorporate it into our public humanities. For example, the Ancestors games that we already mentioned was developed with teaching in mind, but it is also a fun game. So it's educating the audience in a serious but a subtle way. Some archaeologists have even developed games out of their own research. For example, Sean Graham and Tom Brugmans, they developed the game Forum, which focuses on trade in the Roman Empire. All this to say that active engagement with video games can be fruitful in many ways. Games can inform the public about actual debates in historical and archaeological research, as well as break with existing tropes and stereotypes. Games are here to stay, so our understanding of their mechanics will enable archaeologists and historians to criticize them constructively and thereby enabling dialogue with the developers.
Thank you very much for your attention. We're looking forward to your questions and comments.